Instantly, the figure sank to the floor, disappearing in blackness. Shocked and anxious, Montague sprang up and ran to his wife's room, awakened her, only to hear denials that she'd been in his room. But he let her there anyway, and attempted to recreate what he'd just seen. It wasn't possible. Her long white nightgown could not be seen with the lights out. She was completely invisible. The ghostly substance had been luminous. For another test, Montague asked her to peer out the window. But upon walking over to it, she could not. The lower blind was well over the top of her head. Just who the young, luminous lady that Captain Montague received a visit from was never learned. And we've been unable to uncover any other reports of her ever appearing to anyone else after that in the old house on Franklin Street.
You are listening to Richmond Revisited. The Richmond newspaper for Sunday, January 23rd, 1921, contains a rather interesting column written by Dr. C.A. Bryce. It describes a prolonged effort to identify a beautiful young girl he saw in a window late one evening as he passed down a street in Jackson Ward. 'Twas past midnight on a blustery November evening when Dr. Bryce first learned of a mysterious house in Jackson Ward. Under the overcast sky, in the night where the gloom was intensified by the absence of all pedestrians except for himself and a messenger who was conducting him to some poor sufferer. But the messenger started a long way around the patient's home, and when pressed, he told the doctor he had no intention of walking in the same block where that old house stood, an old house that was haunted. Well, finally, the doctor won out. They passed the house with apprehension, but much to the relief of the messenger, nothing happened. But Dr. Bryce was intrigued. He decided upon a closer look later. Upon a return from seeing the patient, the doctor strolled closer to the old house with its half-open front door. It was about that time that he began to think he actually saw something white and small moving across the porch floor. But before he could be sure, it disappeared. The doctor decided it was his mind's eye that created it, and he walked on home. For about 2 years after that, Dr. Bryce saw or heard nothing further about that old house. But then, early one morning, about 2, the doctor was passing by the house, enjoying the clearing skies and the freshness of the air after an early thunderstorm. Dr. Bryce says by coincidence, he glanced upward to the sashes opening in the upper story, just as a brilliant gleam of moonlight fell on the doors and the windows, and there he beheld the face of a beautiful young girl, clad in night clothes, and hair being blown fitfully through the open sash by the wind. But before he could utter an exclamation, the apparition was gone. The next day, Dr. Bryce took a friend with him to explore the entire premises, but it was evident no human had been there in years. The dust was undisturbed in the rooms. And try as he may, the doctor could not learn who the last occupants of the house were, or when it was left vacant. No one in Richmond seemed to know. About 5 more years went by. Dr. Bryce couldn't put the vision of the young girl out of his mind. He kept inquiring, and finally, An old gentleman in his 70s who virtually lived the life of a hermit in a cabin to the rear of a lot adjacent to the old deserted house, sent for the doctor. The old man told Dr. Bryce how foreigners had been the home's last occupants many years ago, and how they had kept to themselves, and how at one time he and his mother had been employed there. And the old man recalled there was a lovely young daughter who apparently had been seeing a young man of whom the father did not approve. And one day, the young man came to the home, and there was a quarrel between the father and the young man. The story has it, the young man demanded satisfaction, and the father chose to duel him in New Orleans. And then one day, the daughter turned quite pale as she read a newspaper and fell into a dead faint. Her mother grabbed the paper, looked at it, and screamed like somebody wild, said the old man. Although he didn't know what they had read, the old man theorized it was probably an account of either one or both of the gentleman's death. No one ever again heard from either man. The daughter took to her bed, where she proceeded to waste away. And from what Dr. Bryce learned from the old man, the face that he had seen at the window had been that of the young girl. It must have been, for it was looking out of the window of the room where the old man said she died. Looking out, Dr. Bryce recalled, as though she might see her lost lover returning to her, and returning after all the years of that deserted, storm-swept street. And according to the old man, her last words had been, "Tell Henri I'll always be waiting for him at the window."
Similarly interesting tale was unfolded in the June 29 edition of an 1890 Richmond newspaper. Seems a young man was strolling near 5th and Lee Streets in Richmond when he passed a vacant and silent-looking house. At an upper window, his astonished eyes gazed upon the solemn face of a sad-eyed, hooded nun peering out. The melancholy steadiness of those eyes looking down on him from their frame of black veiling left him with only one conscious impulse. Release the prisoner. Release the prisoner. So, bounding up those trackless, dust-covered steps, he tried in vain to open the front door. There was a for sale sign tacked upon it. In spite of the late hour, the man persuaded a real estate agent to bring keys, and together they would free the nun. The agent came, obviously deciding to favor the lunatic. But even with darkness coming, the two could make out the face of the nun as they pressed close. Bravely, they entered the old house. Across the carpetless floor they went, and then up the rickety stairs. Into a room where they expected to find a miserable, frightened woman for them to release. There was none. Every indication, every cobweb, each particle of dust told them no one had been there. But they couldn't account for the eerie feeling about them. Each swore that something undefined moved around with them, just enough to disturb the waves of air that came in contact with their bodies. They left. The next day, in the unimaginative clearness of the daylight, and for all of those who cared or dared to look, was the unmovable, steady, pleading stare of the solemn, black-veiled nun. Within 2 weeks, every house in the block was vacated. People shunned the area as surely as if it were a spawning ground for smallpox. The newspaper account says there were several attempts made to burn down the old home, but they only resulted in police patrols being added. Finally, a decision was made to dismantle the house which had brought so much annoyance and mental discord. The sad-eyed nun was shattered in her image existence upon the window pane and driven back into a proper sphere.